Reva, you have more than 2 decades of experience as a geopolitical strategist, advising companies on what on earth's happening around the world. Have you ever seen the United States impose what is essentially an export tax in exchange for those companies being able to export technology to a specific market?
Well, unorthodox is an understatement here, right? And there's that whole pesky detail of what about Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution that says no tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state, meaning any part of the U.S. government, to include the executive branch. So, yeah, we're in uncharted territory here, but it does fit with a highly transactional administration. But as you just referenced earlier, what is exactly the line here? If the administration is driving toward revenue generation, not just in trade policy with tariffs, but even in export controls, right, to include high-end semiconductors, what's the line on what is considered too advanced, right, as it balances against this revenue generation goal?
Let's just repeat that now we've heard from Nvidia. We are hearing from AMD as well, saying that an initial China licenses have indeed been approved, and AMD in confirming it received the China AI chip export licenses, and something that we quizzed Lisa Su on just last week after her earnings, and it's what the market really wanted to hear about, Reva. But go further a little bit here as to ultimately companies looking to sell into China, thinking longer term whether they'll remain to have access. The response from China thus far has been one of concern about, well, the amount of information and so-called backdoors they've been questioning, particularly with Jensen Huang.
Well, Trump has made himself intrinsic to the U.S.-China chip wars. So now we need to see how far this actually goes. Le Boutin is going to be in the White House. Can he pull off a Jensen? That still remains to be seen, but Intel has a lot of problems attached to it. And there is an American imperative to create an American chip champion out of, Intel's setbacks. And so I think there's a lot more deal making to come out of that as well. But, with this level of transactionalism, there's always a degree of uncertainty of how long does this actually last? If we are applying a sliding scale to chip sales to China, then at what point does that start to retrench as U.S.-China AI competition is undoubtedly intensifying? We're still in the early stages of AI diffusion. As we start to see more of these physical AI applications become more real, right? As we wrap our heads around that, as we wrap our heads around the competitiveness issues around that, the critical inputs where China still has intense leverage, will we start to see a delayed reaction in the U.S., that freak out moment, so to speak, where these kinds of controls could fall back to a more restrictive nature?
Reva, push us forward. Has the American president decided to forego national security concerns for $1 billion at least per quarter coming in from Nvidia, if our math is right, and what 15% earns them? Or do you think that they can manage to in some way location track and understand what really ultimately gets into the Chinese tech stack and how it is used?
Well, there are a couple different issues here, right? H20s are optimized for inference compute. So the assumption that the administration is making here is that inference compute is not the chief national security concern. Now, that raises a question, again, if Huawei is able to produce comparable chips to Nvidia or AMD, will we see U.S. chip controls ease, right, to allow U.S. technology complete head-to-head with Huawei? So again, where is that line drawn? But still, we're in a highly transactional phase here, and so we need to see just to what degree is the U.S. going to be concerned about those end uses. And again, the economic competitiveness concerns are still in play here.
I don't know. H20 can be used for training. It's had performance engineered out of it. But I know, talking to a lot of people inside the company, there are lots of questions here. You said something a minute ago, doing a Jensen or pulling a Jensen. I find that so interesting because his principal argument, in line with what we've just debated about H20, is if you don't export American technology, China will use a domestic champion's technology, and then they'll start exporting it to other international markets. Forget the revenue side of this for a minute. Is this smart by Trump to kind of have the PR effect of allowing them to export technology to an economic adversary and at the same time doing a deal, showing that he's got something out of it?
It's a slippery slope. And as we're seeing the preparation for a US China summit between Trump and Xi, what is Beijing thinking at this point? Obviously, it wants to take advantage of this highly experimental transactional phase. So, what is it going to push for? We know they're pushing for an easing of the 20% fentanyl tariffs. On the chip controls front, they're going to want to push for an easing of high bandwidth memory chip restrictions. Now, that's really tricky, right? Because if you start to say, okay, because Chinese memory chip makers are becoming competitive in this domain, that the US will allow Micron, for example, Samsung, SK, to export these chips to the US. That doesn't help Nvidia because Huawei is getting access to HBM chips that are going to improve its production, right? So you see a selective application of that sliding scale approach. And the US so far is also not easing semiconductor manufacturing equipment controls, right? So the tools to actually make those chips. If the US imperative is to throttle Chinese chip production, really constrain that so that US companies like Nvidia and AMD can flood the zone in the Chinese economy,
Right.
get the Chinese technologists addicted, so to speak, to US tech, you don't necessarily want to help Huawei, right, in its
Reva?
production either.
How do you anticipate China's going to respond to this?
Well, China has a ton of leverage at this point with the critical raw material, the rare earth licenses. And if you look at comments from USTR recently, Jameson Greer, and what you can see from those talks is that that issue of licensing for critical inputs seems to be a major theme of the U.S.-China bilaterals. So if the U.S. Raises threats on tariffs or raises technology controls in any significant way, China can basically say, look, the terms of Stockholm or whatever European capital, they're off and you're not getting your licenses and your production lines are going to be paralyzed, and good luck with your manufacturing ambitions, right? For this big AI renaissance, for your manufacturing renaissance, we hold the cards. And at least for the duration of the Trump term, that is an uncomfortable truth.